Hello, I'm Julian Bugini. I'm the Academic Director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and welcome to the latest in our series of talks, or our London lectures, which this year has the theme of a Philosopher's Manifesto. We are inviting philosophers from all parts of the world, diverse backgrounds, different philosophical schools, to present us with some kind of proposal for a policy or a law and give the philosophical case for it, perhaps to try and show that there is a room for rational and argued and measured debate in a world which is increasingly polarised and shrill. This evening I'm delighted to have Myisha Cherry with us here. She's Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. Her interest lies in the intersection of moral psychology and social and political philosophy. And her books include The Moral Psychology of Anger, which she co-edited with Owen Flanagan, and Unmuted, Conversations on Prejudice. Unmuted is also a podcast, a very interesting podcast which she regularly presents. And this evening, Myisha is going to give the case for anti-racism training in federal and state-funded programs. And after she's spoken for around half an hour, we'll have a discussion. You can submit your questions too. A little word on that, you put them into the chat box. It really helps us if you think about how you phrase them before you put them there, because if you can fit them within the 200 characters so we can put them on the screen to display them, that really helps us. And please phrase your question in a way that anyone can understand it. Don't ask us to sort of comment on just some scholar or some paper or other, but we'll take as many of them as we can. So let's start Myisha's talk.
So I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I know that so many events online is clamoring for your attention, so I thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. I would like to thank the Royal Institute of Philosophy for organizing this event and for inviting me, and I'm so looking forward to the Q&A discussion time. So today I want to argue for anti-racist training in federal and state-funded programs. And our time together is going to proceed as follows. I want to talk about some events that has occurred in the United States that have challenged the very notion, the very content of anti-racist training, particularly in federal, state, federal funded programs. So I want to talk about those particular events, primarily focusing on the executive order that President Trump had put out in September. And then I'm going to analyze the criticisms of the Trump administration on anti-racist programs. Then I want to take for a moment for us to kind of consider what is happening in response and as a result of these criticisms. And then I'm going to make some suggestions of what I think should happen as a response. Okay. So in September, President Trump issued an executive order. And I just want to read a few excerpts explaining the executive order. September was a very packed month. Not only was the executive order issued following this executive order, there was also a memo that was distributed to federal agencies, kind of echoing in non-legal language some of the spirit of this executive order. And also in September, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, there was a commission held at the White House on U.S. history in response to anti-racist history of the United States and racism, a project that I'm also going to talk about. So there's several events that has happened in September, but the executive order itself had the power to do some things on the ground, which I explained. So here are some excerpts from the executive order, and it reads as follows. From the battlefield of Gettysburg to the bus boycott in Montgomery and the Selma to Montgomery marches, heroic Americans have valiantly risked their lives to ensure that their children will grow up in a nation living out its creed, expressed in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It was the belief in this inherent equality of every individual that inspired the founding generation to risk their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to establish a new nation, unique among the countries of the world. Thanks to the courage and sacrifice of our forebears, America has made significant progress toward realization of our national creed. Today, however, many people are pushing a different vision of America that is grounded in hierarchies based on collective social and political identities, rather than in the inherent and equal dignity of every person as an individual. This ideology is rooted in the pernicious and false belief that America is an irredeemable racist and sexist country, that some people simply on account of their race or sex are oppressors, and that racial and sexual identities are more important than our common status as human beings and Americans. This destructive ideology is grounded in misrepresentations of our country's history and its role in the world. Unfortunately, this malign ideology is now migrating from the fringes of American society and threatens to infect core institutions of our country. But training like that, discussed above, perpetuates racial stereotypes and division and can use subtle coercive pressure to ensure conformity of viewpoint. Such ideas may be fashionable in the academy, but they have no place in programs and activities sponsored by federal taxpayer dollars. Therefore, it shall be policy of the United States not to promote race or sex stereotyping or scapegoating in the federal workforce or in the uniformed services, and not to allow grant funds to be used for these purposes. In addition, federal contractors will not be permitted to inculcate such views in their employees. So that's just an excerpt from the executive order, kind of explains the policy that the executive order is trying to put in place. And the groups, as kind of reiterated, kind of summarizing the applicable groups that the executive order applies to are federal contractors, executive agencies, the military, and recipients of federal grants. And so if one is bringing anyone who is doing such training, whether someone is contracted to do such training, whether one has a nonprofit organization that is funded by the United States government and one uses someone who's going to do a particular training, they want to restrict such content from being communicated. So what is the impact, or what has the impact been? As you all know, there was recently an election, so we do not know the extent of what's going to happen when President-elect Biden takes office. Hopefully he takes office in January. But one of the things that we know that as of now, since the order was sent out, that the applicable groups have suspended their trainings. And what has been offered up is that they would submit all of their training materials, every one that they use. They were to submit this to the proper authorities so the proper authorities can look over the content of such trainings to make sure that there was certain kind of wording or usages that were not promoting some of the worries that was echoed in the executive order. And until they were able to review or finish reviewing those things, all trainings have been suspended. Also, there was a hotline that was created to report any incidents of any training that would communicate those particular ideas. And then last but not least, one of the things that has happened as a result, lots of people are afraid, lots of organizations are afraid to lose any kind of funding from the federal government. And so in addition to these trainings, this kind of fear have caused them to halt all diversity and inclusion work. And this is not the case for every organization, but this fear of losing funds have just allowed them to say, hey, we're not doing anything that has anything to do with diversity and inclusion. Although it has been directed that that's not what the policy is after, people are afraid. And so they have decided to halt that kind of work. Okay, so that's the impact. So let's go a little bit more detail to look at some of the claims and concerns that is in the executive order, not only in the executive order, but also in the memo that was sent out, but also in some views that was articulated at the commission. So let's look at some specific targets and also some concerns of the policy. So in a broad kind of sense, what they are targeting is any kind of training that promotes the idea that America or Americans of any race or sex is inherently racist or evil, right? So that's kind of a broad kind of target. More specifically, it's very clear in a lot of documents and a lot of communication that has happened that there are certain terms that they believe that echo this particular idea. One of those terms is white privilege, the idea that as a result in a kind of society that is very, has racial hierarchies, that has a history of colonialism and also slavery, that certain individuals are more privileged than others, that whites are more privileged in very different ways. depending on one's economic situation, but whites are more privileged than non-whites. And another specific term that they have sought to target is critical race theory. And another project they have also targeted is the 1619 Project. I want to focus on the critical race theory and 1619 Project. To be clear, I'm not going to provide a full out explanation of these particular things. I mean, it would take so much more time. It's a course that we would need to kind of understand these specific terms. So I'm just going to give a broad overview. But these are the specific worries of the administration: promoting notions such as white privilege, promoting critical race theory, and they also have issues about the whole project of the 1619 Project. Okay, so what is the worry? So here's President Trump at the 2020 White House Conference in U.S. History, and this is what he says: critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda, ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds that tie us together. It will destroy our country. So we see here that he very specifically targets these specific terms that is said to echo some of the concerns in the executive order. But he goes on to elaborate that it's toxic propaganda, is ideological poison. And then there's a fear, there's a worry that if these things are continued to be taught, that it's going to dissolve our civic bonds and destroy our country. Okay, so what are our options here as critical thinkers? So one option we can say, if this is true, if what the executive order have suggested is the case, if what President Trump is saying is the case as far as the poison, the propaganda, if it's true, then we do have reasons to be suspicious of these kinds of trainings that have this particular content. And we also have reasons, if we are the federal government, to not fund them, right? To defund them, right? If true. So that's option A. But there's a second option on the table before us. If these claims are false, then we have reasons to lessen our suspicion of these kinds of trainings that have this particular content. And we have reason to fund these programs, continue to fund these programs in accordance with our diversity and inclusion goals of these particular organizations. Okay, so let's try to analyze if indeed these claims are true. Okay, so let's look at critical race theory first. Like I said, I'm just going to give a broad overview first. So Trump goes on to continue to talk about critical race theory. He says, critical race theory is a Marxist doctrine holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression. It's being deployed to rip apart families, neighbors, and families. Okay? All right. So that's Trump. All right. So let's just take a look at UCLA, which is a law school in Southern California, who is known to have lots of professors who teach and write on critical race studies. They disseminated a response to Trump's claims kind of in defense of critical race theory. And this is what they have to say. So one of the things that they accuse Trump of is kind of a misinterpretation of sorts, right? So this is how they explain critical race theory. They say, critical race theory invites us to confront with unflinching honesty how race has operated in US history and our present, and to recognize the deep and ongoing operation of structural racism through which racial inequality is reproduced, right? So this is their definition of critical race theory. And one of the central principles that they hold, which is the opposite of what Trump claims, Trump would like to think that critical race theory teaches that America and Americans are inherently racist, or some Americans are inherently racist. One of their central principles to refute this claim by Trump is to suggest that they argue that there is nothing inherent about race, right? So there seems to be kind of a mismatch of sorts that the inherent racist and sexist claim is being attached to critical race theory, particularly when critical race theory rejects the whole notion that race contains any inherentness. Another thing that they respond to is that they simply suggest that what Trump is doing is kind of creating a caricature of critical race theory. And it's a caricature that seems to reduce a sophisticated field of knowledge to the simplistic absurdities of America is inherently racist and some Americans are inherently racist and sexist, right? It's a caricature of sorts, right? To answer the claim that it's anti-American propaganda, the statement simply suggested that this is not the case, right? And one of the things that they kind of lay out is they say, hey, listen, critical race theory is necessary, particularly if, as Americans, we hope or we want to live up to our principles, our egalitarian principles. We want to live up to the promise of equality for all. Critical race theories help us to do just that, right? So they basically say what's happening in the administration is they are misinterpreting what critical race theory, to be nice, they are misinterpreting what critical race theory is all about. But there also is a misguided implication that's happening here. If you can recall, President Trump believes that critical race theory has no place in not only in American trainings, but also in America in general. It has no place. But their response is that when you look at the impact that critical race theory has had on legislation, on court cases, on programming, and on policies, they beg to differ, right? And here are some examples that they kind of point out to some kind of theoretical concepts that they have discovered, that critical race theorists have discovered, that has been very helpful on the ground with not only how we relate to each other in our day-to-day practices, but also how we go about justice and treating people fairly. So here's an example. If employees learn, and this is from the statement, if employees learn about the theory of intersectionality, for example, the theory that that there are very, our identities and the oppression that comes with those identities, we can experience kind of a double bind of sorts depending on those particular identities. So if I'm born Black and queer, I can experience kind of a doubling of oppression as a result of being Black and queer. That's very distinct from just being Black, right? And it suggests that if employees learn about this theory of intersectionality, right, it can help motivate federal programs to address the disparities that particular individuals face that may not look like other individuals, right? Another kind of impact, as opposed to being divisive and being against equality, they suggest that when federal employees learn about the dangers of implicit bias, this unconscious bias that we have that informs the way in which we relate to people and treat people, if they are aware of the dangers, then this can spur improved processes. And it can allow individuals to have fairer decision making when they extend job opportunities to individuals or when other individuals are receiving federal contracts, right? This is not divisive, right? This is all in the service of going about the work of equality, which America is all about, right? So it's a misguided implication there, all right? So another project that the Trump administration has sought to rebuke is the 1619 Project. So this is what Trump specifically says about the project. By viewing every issue through the lens of race, they, individuals, part of the project, and the New York Times that sponsors it, they want to impose a new segregation. And we must not allow that. So let me kind of briefly explain the project, a project in which President Trump, in response to it, was set up the 1776 Commission as a result, in response to the 1619 Commission to rebuke the project and promote patriotic education. But what exactly is the 1619 Project? So it is a New York Times, I guess you can say kind of a public history project created by Nicole Hannah-Jones, Pulitzer Prize winner, in conversation and collaboration with Byron Stevenson, for example, Khalil Muhammad, for example, historian and poets and artists. What is the purpose of the project? So it's an ongoing initiative of the New York Times, and it aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at their very center. So as opposed to being marginalized, as opposed to being forgotten, as opposed to acting like it never happened, they want to place the consequences of slavery, as well as the contributions of Black Americans at the center of our the US national narrative, right? That's the focus of the project. When you look at the table of contents, you'll notice that work that has contributed to the project. You have scholars talking about giving a full history of slavery. You have individuals talking about the racial wealth gap, giving a history about it, offering up kind of solutions to it. You have cultural critics talking about kind of the influence of Black music on freedom. You have political theorists talking about the undemocratic assumptions of the US. You have other individuals kind of giving a history and analysis of how Black individuals have fought for freedom in the US. You also have Stevenson basically laying out how race impacts the prison system. This is the table of contents that you get when you click on the 1619 Project. And as you'll see there, if that's the case, then we clearly see kind of a misinterpretation of sorts, right? So remember, for Trump, what the 1619 Project is doing is viewing every issue through race, right? And I think that's a misinterpretation. I believe that what's happening is that they're bringing to the forefront and reminding Americans that the history of America is a history of race, right? Black music, right? History of America. You can't talk about music without talking about race. But you can't also talk about the prison system without talking about race, right? The history, they acknowledge that the history of America is a history of race. There's also a misguided implication that's happening as well, right? So for Trump, he says, listen, given the content of the 1619 Project, it is unpatriotic. And if it's unpatriotic, it's not patriotic, so it's something that we do not need in America. And I think what the 1619 Project is doing for Americans is that it's reminding us that although our past and our present may be haunting, it is still true. And it's necessary for us to teach it. And just because it is haunting, it doesn't mean that it's unpatriotic, right? To the claim that it imposes segregation, we know that there is no evidence of such a thing. It exposes why America is segregated. It exposes why is there a red line? How did that come about? How did that create the racial wealth gap? Right? It's exposing kind of the history of segregation. It's not imposing a segregation. But also, I think it's reminding us that just because we may be uncomfortable with the facts, it doesn't mean that this discomfort equals or equates to division in the country, right? So what's the verdict? I believe that the claims that the administration has made in relationship to these particular projects, but also to anti-racist training in general, overall is untrue. And I also believe that their worries that they have connected to it is unwarranted. All right. Okay. So something has to be happening, right? And I'm going to try to give an account of what I think is happening. I mean, one might say that what is happening here is that they're simply being racist or they're simply being sexist and they want to retain their power. I think that's too simple. And I want to, and not to say that that may not be the case, but I want to go into a little deeper about what I think is happening. So one of the things that I think is happening, and there are many individuals, particularly political theorist, political philosopher Colleen Murphy, who has echoed the same sentiment, is that what a lot of people think is happening is that what's on display is a denial, right? And there's several ways that we can deny our past as Americans and also deny what's happening in the present. I mean, there's kind of an explicit or literal kind of denial in which we suggest that, hey, structural racism does not exist today, right? So that kind of literal denial. But then there's also a kind of denial in which we acknowledge that wrongdoing has happened, but as the statement suggested, we have made progress. So things are not as bad as they once were, right? This kind of belief yes, wrongdoing may be happening, but it's not to the level that it once was, and so it's a kind of a downplaying of wrongdoing. So there's a lot of ways in which individuals are experiencing denial in relationship to these things. I also think that not only that what's happening is a denial of sorts, but we also see a submerging of history, right? Wanting to not acknowledge the history of America, right? And this really reminds me, it's unfortunate, but I think there's no other scholar that has been able to kind of articulate what happens when you try to or attempt to and why you want to submerge history. So here is W.E.B. Du Bois. He wrote Black Reconstruction, trying to give an account, his own historical account of what was Reconstruction like for African Americans, what were the impacts of it, and how did it help. And in the last chapter of Black Reconstruction, in a chapter called The Propaganda of History, this is Du Bois kind of talking about the seduction of submerging history. He says, how the facts of American history, and we're going to see kind of very similarities between what he is stating in this early 20th century work to what is happening now in 2020. He says, quote, how the facts of American history have in the last half century been falsified because the nation was ashamed. What are American children taught today? We have too often a deliberate attempt to change the facts of history that the story will make pleasant reading for Americans. If we are going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego, and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history as a science. This may be fine romance, but it is not science. It may be inspiring, but it is certainly not the truth. And beyond this, it is dangerous, right? And so I think denying what critical race theory is trying to illuminate, I think denying our racial past, in which I think the 1619 Project is trying to illuminate, and how anti-racist trainers are trying to bring that knowledge into these trainings to inform individuals to make sure they don't repeat the same thing. I think a denial of that and wanting to suppress that is feeding into a romance that we have of America. And although we want to be inspired to think that America is finally equal, and no one is racist or sexist, and we all need to be together, one of the things that Du Bois reminds us is that this is not true and it's dangerous. So how is it dangerous? We know that there's an impact and buying into denials and buying into a certain kind of history in relationship to race. We know that it interferes with justice. I mean, how can you administer racial justice in your capacity as a federal employee when you are in denial that there are certain structures of racism that still exist, right? It's going to interfere with racial justice. It's going to interfere with Colleen Murphy refers to as transitional justice. But also, I believe submergent history, it affects our day-to-day lives, right? So, anytime you tell, someone to go back to their country, a Black American, for example, to go back to their country, there's an acknowledgement in some ways or a confession of sorts that one is unfamiliar with history, right? Even in that very statement, that one does not know that the history for Black Americans, that America is their country, right? So it affects our day-to-day actions. When you think about what motivated Dylan Roof to go into a church in South Carolina and kill 8 African Americans after they invited him into their church. I mean, he had a different version of history. And he wanted that romance of white supremacy to resurrect itself in some kind of way. So it negatively affects our day-to-day lives. But I also think, one of the things that I'm worried about is that this is going to set a precedent, this denial, this submersion of history through the executive order is going to set a precedent for future trainings. Not only that, what happens in those federal contexts, but also education, state education, and also knowledge production, right? So what do I think needs to happen? Well, several things. If we accept option B, that these claims and worries, these claims are false and these worries are unwarranted, then we have reasons to lessen our suspicion of these kinds of trainings and to continue to fund them in accordance with our diversity and inclusion goals, right? That was the option that I proposed earlier. I want to make a revision here. And I want to say, given everything that I've just said, everything that I just explained, the criticism of these particular projects, which reveals, like I said, misinterpretation and also misguided implications, it motivates me to make a revision to option B. So here's my revision. If these claims are false, so these are not just claims that one is making in the barbershop, right? These are claims that one has issued an executive order, that one has established a commission on, that one is willing to defund programs, right? If it's false, then we have more reason to lessen our suspicion. And we have more reason to continue to fund these programs in accordance with our diversity and inclusion goals, right? Why? Because this shows that Americans are still misinformed about race, even our leaders. It shows that there's still a spreading of misinformation of sorts from our leaders all the way down. It shows that Americans are still in denial about our racial past and also our racial present. It also shows that even those who are leading our country in executive position have bought into certain myths, one of those myths being the myth of racial progress. And if that is the case, I think, number one, as far as what needs to happen. I think this makes a case. I mean, this is a test case. This is an example, an exemplar for why there is a need and why anti-racist training and education needs to continue, right? It makes a case, given that there's so much information, so much spreading of information, so much denial, and so much myth making. This makes a case for anti-racist training and education. And this really reminds me of Frederick Douglass, the power of such education and also the fear of such education. So Frederick Douglass writes in one of his biographies, My Bondage, My Freedom, when he's recollecting and recalling when his mistress was teaching him how to read and how his slave owner found out that she was teaching him. And this is how he describes the experience. And I think this really illuminates for us kind of the power of knowledge, but I think for our purposes, the power of racial knowledge. So this is what he says, and this is how he describes it. He says, Mr. Aud forbade continuance of her instruction, telling her it was unlawful, it was unsafe, and teaching a slave child how to read could only lead to mischief. Learn him how to read, and he'll want to know how to write, and he'll be running away with himself. He continues, the effect of his words on me stirred up not only my feelings into a sort of rebellion, but it awakened within me a slumbering train of vital thought. It was a special revelation. This is what Douglass realized. Knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. So he continues, and the very determination of his slave master to keep him ignorant, he says, only rendered me the more resolute in seeking intelligence, right? I honestly, believe this is so true. And for our purposes, I honestly believe that certain kinds of racial knowledge, no matter how uncomfortable it is, not only does it unfit a contemporary child to be a slave in what other way, in several ways, whether a woman to be a slave to sexism, a Black African-American, an African-American to be a slave to racism. But I think knowledge, the kind of racial knowledge that's being taught in these anti-racist training programs also unfits individuals to be a master, right? And I think, kind of similar to Douglas's response, the very determination for the administration to keep individuals ignorant of this racial knowledge, I think it should render us all the more resolute in seeking this racial intelligence through anti-racist training. Number two, I think that this also makes a case to extend it to state agencies. So of course, executive order, of course, its jurisdiction is federally funded programs. It can only have a say about those programs that it is funding. So it is targeting federal programs. But given, that it's not just federal programs that administer justice, it's not only federal programs that initiate policies. I think this also makes a case for us to take very seriously the continuation of anti-racist training and state-funded programs, right? So if denials and submersion of history interferes with racial justice, but there are state-funded programs whose sole purpose is to administer justice, then they also need to be trained in these matters, right? If it negatively affects our day-to-day actions, they also need to be trained in these particular matters. If the results of critical race theory, for example, shapes legislation, court cases, programs, and policies, this just doesn't take place on the federal end. It also takes place locally. And so it's a good reminder of how this also needs to continue on the state level. Another thing that I think needs to happen is that the curricula that is currently being reviewed, that is trying to see if any of these trainings have those buzzwords, white privilege, critical race theory in them, for example. I honestly believe that that's the wrong way to do it, of course. But one of the things I think that needs to happen going forward is that the curricula that is taught in these anti-racist training programs, they should be peer reviewed and not politician reviewed. Right. So just as in academia, if I have a paper that I want to get published, that paper is sent to other experts in the field to evaluate the tenability of my claims to make sure that it's up to a certain standard. Likewise, I think that these training curricula need to be evaluated not by politicians, but also be evaluated by historians, be evaluated by theorists, be evaluated by other trainers. I think they are more in a position to let us know if indeed they violate the principles of the United States, and if indeed they are promoting not only propaganda, but false ideology. And lastly, I believe that what needs to happen is that those with funding power, the president, those with funding power should also participate in these anti-racist trainings, particularly if they are in the power of just, administering these funds. There are certain things that they need to learn. One of the things I think they need to learn is this experience and all these events that happened in September that has happened. It's pretty clear that they need to cultivate intellectual humility. I mean, to hear Trump say that critical race theory is a Marxist ideology, and to say it with confidence, as a theorist, a person with PhD who teach on these issues, I had to laugh from crying. I mean, it's totally not true. Right. And I think in these trainings, what they're going to learn is that, listen, you think you know what you need to know about race, but you don't know it all. Right. And there are people that are willing to teach you. So I think as a result of these programs, it's going to help them to cultivate their intellectual humility. It's also going to help them cultivate what I call racial emotional intelligence. Right. I think that lots of people are responding to these kinds of trainings with fear, with discomfort, and also with shame. And I think racial emotional intelligence is going to teach us how to analyze our emotions, our racial emotions, and also to manage them, to make sure that just because one is uncomfortable with a certain kind of history, that one doesn't use that discomfort to stop the dissemination of knowledge that can make all of us free. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Myisha. That's a talk I'm going to share with as many people as I can afterwards. It raises so many important points. One thing I wanted to, and please do ask your questions if you're watching out there, put them into the chat box and we'll take as many as we can. I have plenty on my own, I have to say. First of all, I want to ask you something about your whole approach, actually. One thing that struck me about this talk was you were talking about this executive order from Trump. And when you start at the beginning to say the kind of things it contained, I can imagine a lot of people are just outraged, dismissive, and that's the end of it. Now, it seems to me that in a way, in going through this the way you've done it, you've taken the kind of basis of that, the motivation of that, quite seriously. Some people might say you've even taken it more seriously than it deserves. Is there a deliberate reason why you've chosen to approach it in the way that you've done?
Yeah, so I think there's the three levels in which we can criticize what's happening, right? So in the executive order, it's written in a way in which if I didn't know where it came from, I would think that it was a brilliant document that it should have been instituted a long time ago, right? It's carefully worded. And I honestly like the way in which it's worded, right? You move from that to the memo that was sent out from the Office of Management and Budget, in which it gets less, let's say, legally worded. And then you start to kind of detect the intentions of it. And then you hear kind of the commission that he set up and the press conference, which is a little bit more explicit. And there's some gaps in which you can't really take him intellectually seriously. So I think the reason why I wanted to focus on the executive order, because I think it's an order that I think at the end of the day we can all accept. And I think it deserves our attention. That's one end. But I also think, it's easy to attack a claim or attack an argument when the weakest argument is presented. And what I wanted to do is to tackle the strongest argument in the arsenal, which I think is the executive order. So that was the methodology. I wanted to attack the strongest, try to be as charitable as possible with the strongest against the strongest argument, and respond to that, because I think that's the thing that can persuade people that may be in the middle. And so I wanted to meet the administration at the strongest argument, which I thought the executive order was.
It reminds me of what a mistake a lot of people thought it was when Hillary Clinton talks about the deplorables.
Right.
Do you think that despite the fact that people might feel perhaps very rightfully angry, they need to kind of in a sense, hold themselves back, and if they don't treat the people they disagree with a certain amount of respect and seriousness, it's going to be very counterproductive, to say the least.
Yeah, particularly in our country now. I mean, you all know about the results of the election. What's been the headlines recently is America's divided, it's polarized, we need to meet, we need to talk, et cetera, et cetera. So people are recognizing that there needs to be some kind of conversation of sorts. And the question is, well, how do you get that conversation started? How do you even engage in a philosophical argument with one's opposition? And I think, a virtue is to take them seriously, to even take their arguments. I've described an argument presented in the executive order that was very carefully worded, and it sounds very inclusive on its face. But I think we need to begin to kind of adopt those virtues in our day-to-day. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we compromise. It doesn't necessarily that we take all claims that can be disrespectful or dehumanizing as so serious. But that's not to suggest that there aren't claims that we can take seriously, that we can engage in. And so that's basically the challenge. Particularly, I think, if those claims can have the impact in which the claims and the arguments that the administration has instituted, I think we do indeed need to take them seriously.
Let's take a few perhaps of those points and take them a bit seriously, a bit further. One thing you talk about here is that people seek a comfort in what you call the myth of racial progress, that they kind of deny there's still a problem. Someone might come back on that and say, look, okay, if you're going to say telling ourselves there's been progress is a reason to be complacent, then that would be wrong. But there has been progress, hasn't there? And are we in danger perhaps of understating that? If we understate that there has been progress, again, the message won't be credible, because people will, for example, someone like yourself, you wouldn't be in the position you're in today several decades ago, perhaps. So how do we play that carefully so that we don't allow the story to be comforting, but we don't deny gains that have been made? Or do you think we're in denial there? On balance, there haven't been gains.
Yeah, so I think you can say that there has been progress, but that doesn't necessarily suggest that you have fallen under the seduction of the myth of progress, right? So it is the case, and we can look at data to suggest 200 years ago, it would not be the case that I wouldn't have been able to go to school and get a PhD, right? So we might say on this particular end, it shows some kind of progress, right? But here's the myth of that progress. To then use me as a basis, or use my progress to suggest that all African Americans or all non-whites have in every way equal opportunity to get an education, to get a PhD, right? Is not necessarily the case, because we're not taking into account economic inequality. That's also influenced by race. So we're not taking into account all these other things, right? So it's the myth, right? So the myth likes to obscure other elements. So the myth of racial progress suggests that we can have a Black president. And the myth of that is to suggest that if we have a Black president, everything is okay in every way, right? Like we have improved in every way. But we also know during Obama's administration is when the Black Lives Matter movement came into fruition, right? It's to suggest that even while we had a Black president, there was still, police brutality in Black communities, right? So it is the case that we can acknowledge progress, but I think the myth of the progress suggests that there's progress in every way, right? And yes, it is the case that you can get intoxicated and become kind of comfortable in which one feels that one no longer needs to do anything. I think that's part of the myth. But I also think that the myth is, it obscures that things are not perfect. Progress, in some ways, we seem to think that progress is perfection. That we're not admitting that although we may see progress in this particular way, there's so many ways in which progress has not been met. And although we may see progress in certain groups and in celebrities, they are not representative of a whole population of people who are still suffering, who are still facing day-to-day injustices. And it's the myth that will allow us to think that a fact of progress equates to a full launch on of utopian realities, and that's not the case.
Thanks so much. We're getting some questions coming through. We've actually got more appreciative comments than questions at the moment. We've got this lovely one from Ahmed Hamad, who says, love the way Myisha speaks. She's eloquent and communicative. The lecture is structured and the suggestions are great. It's an intellectual input to the case in questions from a thinking head. I have to agree completely. Let's get a bit more. You talked about how critical race theory is misrepresented and not very well understood. like any academic discipline, I guess, the fact is most of us don't know much about it, even within philosophy. I mean, most philosophers probably don't know about critical race theory. Um, uh, Perhaps give you the opportunity just to sort of clarify something that, with the tiniest superficial understanding of this, people go, they scratch their heads. And one is that, on the one hand, it said that there's nothing inherent about race. This seems to be something that people generally acknowledge and generally support. But if there's nothing inherent about race, in a sense, why is there a critical? Yeah, why is race then placed at the centre of so many debates? I think again, there's a sort of a comforting line of thought here, which is that look, there's nothing inherent about race, and therefore, anyone who basically, talks a lot about race is therefore talking about something which doesn't really exist, and therefore perhaps we can ignore them. It might sound like an idiotic impression to someone who's within it, but how would you clarify that for people?
No, I like that question because, Imani Perry, professor at Princeton, when she was responding to this, to the executive order, I mean, she clearly said she's unaware of any critical race theory being taught in these trainings for kind of the reason that you kind of talked about. In a lot of ways, a lot of academic subdisciplines, they produce their work in their particular field and it may have some public policy impact, but it's not necessarily the case that what is being taught in those particular arenas or directly being taught in these other kind of spaces. And so one might say, well, where did critical race theory even get on their particular mouths? So Chris Rufo, who was a fellow or is a fellow at the Discovery Institute of Research, criticized critical race theory on Fox News, and he likes to think or credit himself as the person of influencing Trump's views on critical race theory. And so you take what is being taught in these particular places, and you can imagine, and I don't know Chris's story, Chris kind of encountering the idea that this is being taught, or there's books about this, or he may heard a misinterpretation, and now he has these what I consider misinformed views, and he shares this with the president. So a lot of people are misinformed about a whole bunch of things, but it doesn't mean that they're less confident about what they think they know, and they spread this particular information. So I think that is indeed a problem with a lot of this stuff. I mean, before the criticism happened in September, even notions of what identity politics is, which comes from Black feminist theory, has been misinterpreted. What people thought intersectionality has been misinterpreted. I mean, I think this is just what happens when people are trying to understand theory and try to apply it to their lives. There's going to be these kind of misinterpretations here. And I think, no doubt, that is indeed what's happening. So I think when it comes to kind of the inherency of race, I mean, think about this. I mean, I don't think that people are inherently racist. I mean, critical race theory doesn't assent to that claim, right? I think one of the things that if you do any of this kind of race theoretical work, one of the things that you are aware of, that even if what we call biological race doesn't even exist, that doesn't mean that socially we have not created these categories of race. And it also doesn't mean that socially we haven't bought into racial hierarchies and have created systems and ways of interacting in which we privilege one race over the other, right? So it is the case that none of us are inherently racist, right? But that doesn't mean that I can't be taught socially how to view certain people, how to interact with certain people. And so I think you can learn the latter, and I think that is what's being taught. And that's why I think you can be taught in these trainings to kind of rethink, evaluate one's biases, and therefore change one's actions. That would not necessarily be the case if race and racism was inherent in some kind of way. So they're bringing attention to the ways in which we practice racism, which is social. They're bringing attention to the ways in which social structures are created that disenfranchise certain kinds of people. Bring attention to that, address those particular things. And if we do that, then we recognize that we can change those particular things. But I think the inherent arguments, they stop the argument right there in its tracks, right? Inherency suggests that we can't do anything. This is just who we are. But I don't think that that's what they're claiming. I also don't buy into that argument. If it's not who we are, but it's who we become, then we can become something else. And I think that's the challenge of these anti-racist programs.
Thanks so much. We've got a question here from one of our regulars. It's strange to have regulars you recognise only by their icons and their names. You don't see them in the audience. I can't pronounce the surname, but just say Flower. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to explain the term here. In our last series, we heard quite a bit about what's called here epistemic injustice. And to what extent do the Trump supporters wrong themselves as knowers when they simply refuse to hear about race? But perhaps in answering that, perhaps you could just explain what epistemic injustice is, because that's not a term everyone will be familiar with, and then how that does apply to this situation you're talking about.
Yeah, I love this question. So typically when we think about injustice in general, right, we think about a wrong that has been done to an individual that is unfair, that is unjust. And so we can put in front of that racial injustice, which suggests that someone has been harmed or someone has been done unfairly due to their race. But there's also injustice that can happen in the realm of knowledge, hence the term epistemic, right? So there's ways in which I can harm individuals as knowers. And epistemic injustice is a broad category to a lot of kind of harms that can happen under that umbrella. So one wrongdoing that can occur under the umbrella of epistemic injustice is, for example, testimonial injustice, right? So testimonial injustice can occur when I make a testimony and suggest that, hey, I have been harmed in this particular way, and people do not accept my claims. I can bring all the evidence, but people don't take me seriously. And they're not taking me seriously either because I'm a woman, either because I'm poor, either because I'm disabled, or because I'm Black. And in that way, I have been the recipient or the victim of epistemic injustice, particularly as a testimonial injustice. So the ways in which I think one might say Trump supporters, and one has to be very specific about the kinds of Trump supporters, because I think there's a variety of Trump supporters, about in what ways are they harming themselves by not wanting to know about race. I think one might think that when you think about race, that you're only talking about Black folk, or you're only talking about brown folk. But if we take race to also include, white people also have a race. So them not wanting to know about race is also them not wanting to know about themselves, right? And in that way, they're not hearing, we might put testimonial injustice as being an example of what's happened here, right? They're unwilling to even hear their own claims about themselves, or to hear claims about themselves that have been offered about them from other whites. So there's no doubt that I think there's a longer line of whole bunch of other injustices. I think the epistemic injustice is happening not only Trump supporters, I think also liberals as well, not wanting to hear the truth about themselves. And not only about themselves, but also themselves as Americans and also us as Americans. So I think by denying oneself certain amounts of information, someone can do that on your behalf, but by you denying that for yourself, well, by one not, demonstrating the intellectual virtues that I was talking about, we can add honesty, but we can also add kind of perseverance. We can also add curiosity. When one fails to do that for themselves, they are, in some ways, administering epistemic injustice to themselves, but that also has implications for the way in which you relate to others. So the epistemic injustice is not only being done to you, but also being done to others. But race is not just about other people or other races. White folks are included in the issue in the topic about race, and that's why I think it's so important for all of us to be educated on race, because it involves all of us.
Okay, I've got a good question here from John of Welling, if we have that one to come up here, which is, assume Biden-Harris will restart the programs. You gave a good defense why they're necessary. Necessary, yes, but do they go far enough to help mutual understanding of lived experience and not only history? Will it be enough for this executive order to be reversed, essentially?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things I was thinking about in the latter part of the talk. That if this was able to happen on this level, I think we have more reasons, right? So that also suggests that when Biden-Harris goes into the White House, I hope that they are pushed to really take what happened seriously, and to do more, because I think the challenge is that this should awaken us to realize that we need to do more. I don't really have an account other than what I've laid out preliminarily about what needs to be done. But there's no doubt that a lot of us are misinformed about each other. A lot of us are in denials. And as an educator, of course, my response to a solution to that is to educate. But the extent of that education, I don't know the full extent in which we can initiate policies, for example. I've alluded to the federal. If you're funding programs and there's trainings that's being done in those programs, of course, your reach is the federal. But I'm hoping, and I don't know if this is going to be something that the president's wife would do. She's an educator. Well, I don't know who would take this on. But there's no doubt locally, grassroots-wise, communally, that this should be a reminder for all of us to really focus on the importance of this kind of education. And it's not just Trump supporters who are ignorant of this education. For example, for the last couple of years, we've been using kind of terminologies in America of what people have called, quote unquote, Karens. And these are, typically white individuals, white women, who are believed to be kind of liberals, right? Or at least allies. And they have shown behavior that is contrary to that allyship, right? And one of those behaviors have been calling the police on Black folks when it's unwarranted. And given the history of police brutality and what seems to happen when those phone calls are answered, they usually result in death, right? But the threat of doing such is a kind of harm, even if the police don't show up. And these are people who are liberal-minded. So it's no doubt that those individuals also need to be, I would say, re-educated. So there needs to be an education across the board. The extent of who has the power to suggest that we ought to do it. I think federally we can mandate those kinds of things, but there's no doubt where the mandate does not exist. I think we have at least a moral obligation in some sense to institute these programs wherever we may find ourselves. So whether that's in high school, middle school, college, community, grassroots organizations, I don't know. But we should be all the more motivated as members of fellow citizens to do our part to institute these programs, even where federal power is limited.
As a philosopher, you made a very good moral case for why programs of this kind should be implemented. But I guess it's an empirical question, isn't it? What kind of programs do work and don't work? Yeah. I mean, one point there is you mentioned, the talk about toxic propaganda and ideological poison. These things are just false. But one claim about the program is that they threaten civic bonds. I guess unintentionally that's possibly true, but we wouldn't know that simply by looking at the content of the program. We'd have to look at the effect they have on people. And I know that some people, I have heard some people are very skeptical about, for example, the effectiveness of implicit bias training. And I think there's some evidence that it can actually be counterproductive. So, again, you're giving the philosophical case for this kind of program rather than specific ones. But do you have anything to say perhaps about whether we have any reason to believe these things do work and can work?
I mean, I think it's a greater question of, I went to a talk this week in my department, and my colleague Eric Swissgable basically gave a talk about are ethics professors more ethical, right? As it suggests that if you teach it, then it seems to be the case that you would practice it. And so there was a variety of empirical studies done on that. And the conclusion is that that's not necessarily the case. But then when you kind of surveyed students who will take ethical courses, it seems to have some kind of impact, right? So I mean, I think this is a dilemma about education in general, right? The question is, do you do what you were taught? Now, at least this doesn't deny that when it comes to implicit bias, when you bring attention to someone's kind of bias, they may be more conscious of it in a certain kind of way that can be detrimental about recognizing it futurely and doing something about it. There's no doubt that that's the case. But I think the empirical question when it comes to trainings in general is an empirical question about trainings in general, right? How do you ensure that what you teach that people will enact it on the workforce. So that, there are, I don't know if you all have to do this in the UK, but every year we have to take a kind of online course very quickly about sexual harassment so that we can know what sexual harassment is, so that we would not participate in sexual harassment. So we go through these things, blah, 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 and then we submit it. And the question is, how many people who take that survey actually learn not to sexually harass other people? I mean, I think that's an empirical question, but that doesn't suggest that because the data hasn't confirmed its effectiveness, or we haven't created studies to do it, doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't at least try to teach it. So I don't think this is a problem for anti-racist training in general. I think this is a problem for education in general. But until we find the proper methods to judge its effectiveness, at least we can do morally is to begin to teach it.
I mean, a related sort of issue around what we teach is how we teach history. I think what you said about W.E. Du Bois, the propaganda of history, is extremely interesting. It does seem to be the case, and I think we can recognise this in the UK and other countries too, that the history we are taught is often one which is reinforces national myths, glosses over things that don't fit it, and so forth. But then I'm wondering, and I'm wondering, other people might be questioning whether or not what comes in that place, whether you can actually ever have a depoliticized history. I'll give you a small example. There's a wonderful television series on recently presented by Henry Louis Gates Jr., Africa's Great Civilizations. It was very interesting. It basically it made people like myself feel embarrassed. Why don't we know these things? You know, all these things about civilizations of Africa. We just didn't know them. And it was great. It was informative. But you could say that too had kind of a political agenda. A political agenda I might agree with. You know, it's wanting to sort of be affirmative about Africa's history in positive ways it hasn't done before. So are we talking here about, do we just have to accept the fact that history is politics and we just have to make sure we've got the right politics? Or can we take the politics out of history?
Yeah. I think you answered it. I mean, your first part of that question was indeed my answer. I mean, what political agenda? I mean, I would say that as much as everything that's within or under the rim of politics doesn't necessarily suggest it is political, right? I think you can give a history of Africa that is based in facts, and it may have political implications. But it doesn't necessarily mean that one was constructing it, thinking about the script, that one had a political agenda. It could be that one had a truth agenda. And it is the case that there were some political facts, some political challenges that was performed as a result of that. And I also don't think that you can talk about history without talking about politics. But I think this should lessen our suspicion. I mean, I don't think, you know, I recently heard Lewis Hamilton, British F1 driver, when he was trying to describe Black Lives Matter, he basically said, you know, that's not a political message, that's a human rights message, right? I think a lot of things that we find controversial, that we find unsettling, kind of gets under the banner of political, and we tend to think that political has its limits, that political has its own kind of agenda, that that anything that goes under politics has these particular sides. There's somebody who is wrong. But I think just because something has a political implication or entails politics or a history that engages rulers doesn't necessarily mean that one is doing that out of a political agenda, that it could be an issue of truth. And I think, you know, intellectual virtue is wanting to get at the truth, and it's going to have a lot of implications, and that being political. But the question is, what do we do with that? And that is a challenge for lots of us. We like to hide, challenge that truth in unproductive ways, such as desiring that truth does not get disseminated. And then for a lot of us, we're willing to live up to it and accept it. And you think about, I mean, history has come a long way. I'm not a historian. I have friends who are historians, so they're able to get an account much better. But even when you think about philosophy, for example, I mean, the question that we've been thinking about, that how do we reconcile with the history of our quote unquote founding fathers, right? How do we wrestle with Kant's racism? How do we wrestle with Hume's racism? And if we're trying to deal with the history of those thinkers, does that mean that we're doing it with a political agenda? I don't think that's necessarily the case. We're trying to get at truth. We're trying to find ways to handle and to pick up philosophical truth. And there's no way that we can do that without addressing those figures' history. But it doesn't necessarily mean we have a political agenda.
Yeah, thanks very much. Another great answer. Now, we've got some of the questions coming in, I think, are perhaps of a kind of a family resemblance, have a family resemblance.
Okay.
It's that I think you persuaded a lot of people about your broad position, and people are sort of wondering about, you know, the basic case is made, but actually what you want to see doing, it faces difficulties. And here's a question, for example, from Thomas Williams, and he says, what can be done to make people less dismissive of the vocabulary of critical race theory or related anti-race activism? I don't think humility and empathy can be had for overcoming this kind of skepticism. And just as a footnote, I think, you know, in my experience, I mean, this is anecdotal, right? But I'm sure other people agree that in certain circles, people only have to hear certain phrases and
Right.
they just become dismissed. If you think about political correctness, for example, I mean, I always loathe the phrase political correctness. And one reason for that was it just became a way to dismiss things which you might otherwise describe, for example, as, you know, civility, politeness, respect. It's political correctness. The vocabulary itself becomes a kind of a political, doesn't it? If you use that vocabulary, you're kosher, whatever it might be. If you don't use it, then you're not. And also, I wonder whether perhaps, sorry, I'm developing the thought a bit too much. Whether sometimes I think people are told that they have to. Do we emphasise the appropriate use of vocabulary too much sometimes? That someone uses the wrong vocabulary, gotcha, you know, whereas people uses the right vocabulary, you're okay, when perhaps actually they just learned to use the right vocabulary and in their actions they're maybe not right. So anyway, there's a whole cluster of questions here about vocabulary.
Right.
I'll leave you to deal with it however best fit you think it should be.
So I don't think it's the case that immediately someone becomes dismissive of critical race theory, for example, or the very phrase of anti-racism activism, right? I think there's a story that has to be told about how they become dismissive, right? And I think the story that is told is part of the larger problem that I'm trying to bring attention to, which is the misinterpretation and the misguided implication, right? So go back to when I talk about Chris Rufo, how he credits himself with allowing Trump to kind of create this battle against critical race theory. Did Trump one day wake up, hear the term, you know, and just become dismissive, right? Someone was in his ear, gave an interpretation of what he thinks critical race theory is, and kind of incorporated some actors and suggest, well, you know, they're teaching this at the UCLAs and at the Harvards, and they're trying to undermine us, and this is what it is. And then the dismissiveness comes, right? It's the story that we have to tell. And I think it's the story that I'm trying to challenge. It's a story that I'm trying to challenge. Just like I don't think anyone's becomes immediately dismissive of identity politics or any of these kinds of terminologies or vocabularies. Someone hears a certain kind of story, and one of the stories that they hear is kind of a story that's just not the right interpretation of it, and then they become critical of it, and then they become dismissive of it in general. That's not the only way in which it happens, but at least that's what I'm imagining. And I just want to hope that, you know, what I think this challenges us is that if you're that easily dismissive of these terminologies, given that story, I mean, once again, I think this makes a case for the education. I think a lot of dismissiveness is due to a lack of knowledge. A lot of people are just unclear about what these particular terms mean. And Julie, I know about your latter question, which I think I would just spend all day talking about that. But I think a lot of people are dismissive because they already have a conception about what they think take these things to be. And I want to suggest that's usually an inaccurate interpretation there. Even when people think about anti-racism, I think people are totally unclear about what that is. And they probably heard something about what they is, and then they become dismissive. And so, I mean, it's not to say that people have reasons to be dismissive. And it's also not to say, you know, I just believe that everyone can't be on board. There's just going to be people who make those kinds of moves. Dismissiveness is one of those moves, even if they know better. So it's no way that you can erase dismissive folk or skeptical folks. But I think there's a story to be told. And I want to change that story, what happens when someone originally hears those particular terminologies. And I think if they hear what it really is, absent of the intentional political agenda that's usually introduced when these terms, they will be less dismissive.
Okay, got another question here from Grant Silver. The second part I'm not sure I get right, but the first point I think is a clear one. If whiteness rests on oppression and exclusion, isn't it inherently racist. I suppose this goes back to the idea that racial categories are created. There's no biological essentialism about them. And the category of whiteness was created in a context in which whiteness was, again, linked essentially with oppression and exclusion. What do you make of that? And because that's interesting for someone like myself who is white. It seems like the very category that I'm in is just rests upon a history of oppression and exclusion. And where does that leave me?
Right. So I think two things we got to pierce apart, right? So there's a difference between, in very many ways, but I'm just going to make one particular distinction here. There's a difference between the category of white and I think what we're calling whiteness. So it could be the case, Julian, if I can use you as an example, that when you fill out, in America, we call it the census. When you fill out the census and you have to do these kind of racial categories that are just strange, but we fill them out anyway. You just circle that box white, right? You don't circle a box called whiteness. You circle a box called white. It's just these limited racial categories that we have. But whiteness is another thing, right? Whiteness is, one might say, if anything is an ideology, whiteness is an ideology, right? In which one takes it to be the case that one has, that given one's identification as white, that one has, and this goes back to the inherent question, that one has these inherent characteristics, that one is part of a kind of history that makes him superior to others. That's when we begin to get into whiteness, that one should act a particular way and is awarded or rewarded for acting a particular way in relationship to other people. That's when we get into whiteness. But I think the white category as a racial category does not necessarily mean whiteness. And I think what critical race theory, and not just critical race theory, but there's a whole subdiscipline. Wait till the Trump administration hear about this. There's a whole discipline called whiteness studies that examines not the racial category of white, but examines what happens when one takes on a racial identity ideologically, right? Practices that racial identity, interacts with people given that racial identity, thinks of other people given that racial identity, approaches history given that particular racial identity, right? That's whiteness study. And that whiteness category, which is not inherent, yes, is very different from the white category.
Okay, I've got a very direct question here from John Kalecha, perhaps, is how you might pronounce it. Apologies if I get it wrong. It's a question that you've probably been asked before. The wrong one's come up, so ignore that one. It's the question is: do historical injustices validate positive discrimination? It's an old it's a thing people struggle with a lot. Whether positive discrimination is a good policy lever. Are you in favour of positive discrimination? And if so, is historical injustice the reason you're in favour of it?
Right. So in America, we are more familiar with kind of terminology of affirmative action. And tell me if that's the way in which we would compare both of those things: positive discrimination with affirmative action. Julian, help me out with translation here.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think people actually sort of use these terms and they're not quite clear what they mean. I mean, I would actually take positive discrimination to be perhaps I don't think it is the favoured term over here either. I think we would talk about affirmative action. It's basically understood as being positive measures to try and redress imbalances in the representation of people in a workforce or any other kind of setting. Yeah.
So I like the term affirmative action, and it goes back to a certain kind of phrase that people are less dismissive of. If you take it as its original implementation, in which President said, we are going to be affirmative in what we do, right? Action part, right? We're going to take initiatives, be proactive in what we do to make sure that everyone is getting a just chance, an equal chance. Hence, affirmative action kind of policies. I like that terminology much more than I like kind of positive discrimination, because even within the term itself, the phrase itself, it implies that there's some discrimination there. So even if the positive sounds good to you, right, you can't get you can't get rid of the negative connotation that comes with discrimination. Discrimination suggests that there's still going to be a group of that is being discriminated against, and that's unfair. So how can you have something that's positive, but also that's unfair? I mean, it's interesting here. I mean, so in so many ways, I feel like I'm answering a question about affirmative action. I mean, I want to take an easy way out here, and to suggest that one of the things that I feel that is important, that if an injustice has happened, and not only has it happened in the past, but it continues to happen, then there's no doubt that there's something wrong with the system. There's something wrong with the way in which we are doing things, and we need to rethink the way in which we do things, and we need to do things very, very differently. So if it is the case that what we find ourselves is privileging or allowing it to be the case that certain individuals reap the benefits in one certain kind of arena, we need to engage the work of diversity inclusion. I guess that's a better way also to terminology that I like, to diversify and make sure that we are being inclusive, to make sure that other people are also benefiting, right? So that's the also point that is important, because the discrimination point, it just seems to still have this echo of someone is suffering. And usually it's the case that a man is going to suffer at the advancement of a woman, or a white person is still going to suffer or get unfair treatment at the expense of someone else. So I like the inclusion thing, because it suggests that, no, what we're going to do is we're just going to open this up to other people. We're going to create initiatives in which we are opening it up for everyone. And that does require that we do affirmative action in a certain kind of way. Affirmative action meaning that it may be the case that when we advertise jobs, that we only advertise it at a particular website in which we know data-wise only white men, middle class, go to, right? Of course, the people that are going to apply to that job is going to be a certain kind of race. So how do you be more inclusive, right? How do you take the initiative, be affirmative in doing a certain kind of different action, where you start putting that stuff on other websites, where women are submitting applications, where people of color are submitting applications. So it's no doubt that I believe that's the kind of work that we need to do. We need to be affirmative, proactive, and making sure we're doing our very best to include folks, to be more diverse, to make sure that everyone is benefiting. I don't think, I don't agree that this is a zero-sum game. I think there's a lot of resources, particularly in Western countries, to share. And I think, unfortunately, historically, only certain kind of people have benefited from those particular resources. And I think because there has been a long history, we need to change the way in which we do things to make sure that everyone has access to these resources. And not everything is going to feel good. It's going to be outside of our comfort zone and make some people not so advantageous in a certain kind of regard. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should stop wanting to be inclusive. So I like those kinds of initiatives, but I don't like the language of discrimination, because I think we all can benefit.
We'll perhaps come back to comfort zones again in a minute. I'll talk about some of my own discomfort zones. Somebody in the audience are giving us some factual information. Hasn't been fact checked, but Pavlina Wilkin has said that we do talk about positive action. I think she means in the UK, and that positive discrimination is actually legal apart from in relation to disability. I think that's correct, but I'm thinking on the fly. I'm not entirely sure. But actually, there's a concept you mentioned in your talk briefly, which I wonder if you might say something about, because I think it might relate to the things we've been talking about, this concept of transitional justice. Can you just say a little bit about what that means and why it's important for what you've been talking about?
Yeah, so when I reference that term, I also reference a philosopher at the University of Chicago, Urbana Champaign. She's written about this. She has a book about it. She was also a host on my podcast, the Omni Podcast, and that's Colleen Murphy. So she writes a lot about transitional justice. And for those who would like to know, I think she has an upcoming piece in the Boston Review talking about kind of the relationship between transitional justice and particularly these anti-racism trainings. So I think just this is not doing her justice. That's why I preface it with the book information. But I think transitional justice, I mean, how do we transition from a previous unfair state of affairs to a state of affairs that wants to be more just, right? And we can talk about this in the aftermath of a whole bunch of stuff, right? In the aftermath of Jim Crow, how do we transition to a better democratic government? In the aftermath of undemocratic South Africa, how do we transition to a more democratic South Africa? And the transition, even as we think about now, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be so explicit, but when we think about the last 4 years in this country in which certain lives were just underappreciated, like immigrants, Muslim lives, Mexican Americans, Black Americans. How do we transition? I mean, do we just forget that Trump happened? Or do we make a better transition from that, right? How do we transition from something that was distraught, something that was unfair, something that caused so much harm, to just a better state of affairs? I mean, that is the question. And there's a variety of suggestions that Colleen suggests in her work. And I think America is constantly working through transitional justice. I think any nation, because we are all human beings that are part of the nation, that at certain periods of time, we do things that harms different individuals. We need to figure out how to move forward. But it's the moving forward, right? It's the transition in which, by the very wording, suggests that we want to do better. So we're not just moving along, forgetting what happened. We want to transition to a better state of affairs. And the question is, how do we do just that? And I think that's always an open question for states and for governments. And I think when we think about a U.S. context, still thinking through how do we transition right now? How do we transition? Which is, Trump is making it very difficult transition out of the White House. But how do we transition to a more just government? And I have a very small contribution, and I want to suggest that the ways in which we do it is to change the way in which we relate to each other. And a lot of this has to do with what we think we know about each other, and how can we know more about each other, and how can we change our destructive towards other individuals who are deserving of our respect and dignity. And that has always been my project. And that's what I found so disheartening about what has happened in the last few months. And I think, the more we know, the more we grow, right? And I think that learning about these things, learning how to be more anti-racist, which is against racism. I mean, clear and simple, against racist policies, against the unfair, undignified treatment of individuals. If we hold these egalitarian principles like we say we do in America, and I think that's the case in the UK, how do we do better? How do we continue to do better? How do we go about clean ourselves up, learn from our mistakes, and move, not just move on, but move on to bigger and brighter things? That's transitional justice for me. And I think that requires a reorientation to ourselves and to each other, but it also requires education. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize and focus on, and hope that we don't lose.
Thanks so much. You mentioned Frederick Douglass in the talk, and that very powerful quote, "Knowledge unfits a child to be a slave." And you pointed out, as you were saying it, actually, you pointed out what I thought myself, that if that's true, also knowledge unfits a master to be a master. And clearly, this is troubling. If you are historically in the category of the masters, this knowledge is threatening your privilege. And white privilege is one of those terms that the executive order was keen to eradicate. But I'm wondering, if you are in that position of privilege, how far does your responsibility go? So I'll give you a little anecdote to just give you an example of the sort of discomfort I might have. When I organise and I programme series and events, I think I'm very aware, I'm very conscious of things, and hopefully I'm programming in a way which is balanced and so forth. But today I took part in an event, and it was for World Philosophy Day. And, I agreed to it. I didn't really look very carefully. But it was only when it started that I realised I'd agreed to be on a panel for World Philosophy Day, which included 3 white European men and 1 black African woman. And I was uncomfortable there. I think I was right to be uncomfortable. But then I thought, I could just say to myself, well, I didn't realise, too late. Do people like myself have a responsibility to think a lot more about this than we do? And should we write? A lot of people don't like guilt. I mean, guilt is supposed to be a bad thing, right? Don't feel guilty about anything. But shouldn't we feel troubled? Shouldn't we feel worried? Should we not feel yeah, uncomfortable.
Yeah. I like that. All right, not feeling uncomfortable or feeling uncomfortable. I like that. I like that better than the guilt. I tend to have kind of a view of guilt the way in which feminist essayist and poet Audre Lorde felt about guilt, right? That guilt has a tendency not to really motivate you to move in a certain kind of way. Um, it tends to allow you to focus on yourself and your own feelings. But I think the uncomfortable thing, usually when you're uncomfortable, you want to get out of that discomfort and you're willing to do anything by any means necessary to do just that. And I think that's important. I mean, even as you're telling the story here, I'm thinking about for you to arrive at the discomfort stage shows that you have some kind of awareness. There's a lot of people who would have just showed up at the panel and just take it for granted that, hey, it's just us here. We're representative of the field. And so we're going to go on business as usual. But the fact that you recognize that something just wasn't right in that case shows that there's a lot of education and training that has worked on your behalf. That you're able to recognize that there seems to be kind of an injustice here in some kind of way that's happening. And I think that awareness goes a long way. It's no doubt that I think that's going to inform you going forward. I mean, you're part of an event in which I take it to be the case that you didn't have any power organizing, that you didn't even know who was going to be in the panel. So there's really not much you can do, but there's so much more that you can do going forward. And there's no doubt that you're going to remember that and continue to be ever so conscious the way in which you do programming. And I would expect and want, and don't want to use the language of duty here, but I would expect that people who find themselves in certain kinds of situations would use that to make sure that they don't duplicate the same kind of injustice, right? So when it comes to kind of what kind of responsibility, what kind of obligation, one of my students, my dissertation student, is working on that very same thing in his dissertation. Victor, shout out to Victor, who's working on kind of what he calls kind of collective blame. And he wants to say, so in what ways, if I'm privileged in a particular society, am I blameworthy? And if I am blameworthy, then what obligations do I have? And that's a project that he's working on. And I'm sympathetic to it, not only because I'm his dissertation advisor, but I think that indeed that is the case. I mean, he calls it, if you're benefiting from what he calls, blood money benefits, then someone is obligated to kind of respond and do their part to ensure that there's justice being administered. Now, the extent of what one is required to do is the question, right? But I think if we at least accept that we should do something, and whatever that something is, we do just that, then I think that's a good thing, right? I don't think that we need to, folks who are privileged, because it's not just white folks who are quote unquote privileged, find themselves in these positions of privilege, do something. I mean, that's the thing. Don't stop at guilt, but take that discomfort and do something with that discomfort. And I think for lots of people, that they're stuck between, I feel this way, and they're not doing any kind of action, right? So they can analyze, they can tweet about it, they can even teach about it, but it's that action stage that they're feeling at. And I think if all of us are taking some kind of action, regardless of what that action is, then we're moving closer to racial justice. We're moving closer to transitional justice. But I think for lots of people, they're either stuck in the guilt or they don't feel like they have an obligation to do anything. And so they don't do anything. And I'm a believer that, in order for us to really get to more progress that Americans are so obsessed with, everyone has to do their part. I mean, that's why it's a democracy, right? Everybody has to do their part. So the more people that are doing something, the more I think that we're getting close to the change that we imagine.
Thanks so much. I think what you said earlier in the talk actually about discomfort isn't the same as division, and that we may well need to make people feel uncomfortable. That doesn't mean we need to be creating division and sort of pitting people against each other. And in a strange way, I think paradoxically, I think one thing you're able to do very well is you're able to both make us uncomfortable, but in a comfortable way, in a way that's not threatening. I mean, you put people at ease. You enable us to have these discussions, and I think that's one thing that I feel. One of my hopes for public philosophy is that it enables us to have the kind of discussions which are so often tense, so often kind of hostile and hot, about these difficult discussions, but in ways that are respectful and really get to the bottom of it. I think modelled that beautifully, both in your presentation and in your discussion, which very, very grateful for. If this is the first time you've heard Myisha, then I'm sure you'll recognise straight away that she makes a great podcast presenter because of that intelligence and also empathy. And Unmute podcast, I thoroughly recommend it. We do have more talks coming up just before we finish it to give a few trails for them. First of all, in this series next week, we have Jesse Norman. He's a Conservative MP. His talk is entitled, a bit cryptically, The Wisdom of Mentor. The lack of definite article is deliberate. You'll find out more about that later. The week after that, it's Catherine Rowett, who is actually a Green MEP as well as a philosopher, and she's going to be making the case for a universal basic income. And then the last of our talks before Christmas is with Joseph Chan and Brian Wong, who are going to argue for treating legal transgressions as a response to state injustice and argue towards a non-punitive approach to those legal transgressions. Thank you so much, everyone, here this evening. The talk will be on YouTube to watch forever. I'm sure it's one you're going to want to recommend your friends and maybe even some of your opponents. We won't call them enemies because that wouldn't be in the spirit of the evening, to watch as well. Thank you to Matt behind the scenes with the tech, but thanks most of all to Myisha. Really grateful to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.